The Tom Woods Show, episode 1791.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. Well, you may know, either from my email newsletter or from some other source, that we lost Walter Williams this week. He was the great economist, professor, public speaker, syndicated columnist, author, just all-around amazing person, such a persuasive person. He had such influence on so many people, and the topics he discussed almost couldn't have been more controversial. And yet, he never backed down, he never compromised. He's a great example for all of us. And joining me to pay tribute to him and his ideas today is Tom DiLorenzo, who was a colleague of Professor Williams for some time, knew him for probably close to 40 years. Tom himself is recently retired as a professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland, and he's the author of numerous books, including How Capitalism Saved America and some books on Lincoln that I'm sure will come up in the course of the conversation because they're related to Walter Williams. Tom, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Tom, once again.
I feel like I should be saying what people say at a funeral. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances, but I thought, given the influence Walter Williams had on me, I read his columns when I was in high school. Same with Soule and, maybe one or two other columnists, but really Soule and Williams were real regulars for me. And I got to meet him briefly, and I've had him on the show a couple times, but I really, really admired and respected him. So I was very sad to learn he had died. And I know you worked closely with him too.
Yes.
So let's talk about that. How did you get to know him?
Well, I arrived at George Mason University in 1981 as a young assistant professor. I had just finished my PhD at Virginia Polytechnic Institute. They changed the name to Virginia Tech once they got a good football team, but it was VPI back in those days. And Walter got there a year before me, and it was a relatively small department, much smaller than it is now. And so we all knew each other very well, and his office was maybe 5 or 6 paces from my office. And Walter and I both taught, we were the 2 faculty members at George Mason at the time who taught the big sections of 300 or more students in principles of economics. And so I got to know him originally by talking about all those things. And their office configuration was a suite. And so you went through the big double doors, and then we all had our little sort of catacomb there, the economics department. And so we're all very close, and we saw each other a lot. And that's how I first got to know Walter. And just over the years, many programs that were sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies at GMU that Walter participated in. And so that's how I got to know him up to the present day, and I got him to write the foreword to my book, The Real Lincoln, in 2003. And I told the story in the obituary that I wrote on LouRockwell.com about how shortly after that book was published, I get a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning. The phone rings, and it's Walter. And he says, Rush Limbaugh's sick, and I'm hosting the show today. Would you like to come on? And it's like asking me, would you like to win the lottery today? And so right. I did. And so, as a result of that, we spent a whole hour on Rush Limbaugh's audience, with the Rush Limbaugh's audience, promoting my book, basically. And my sales ranking went to number 2 on the next, by the evening.
And by the way, that's sales rank not just for nonfiction titles, which would be impressive enough. But all books. And remember that since nobody reads nonfiction, for a nonfiction title to be number 2 is unbelievable.
Yeah, the only book that outsold me on that day was Montel Williams's Diet and Exercise book. Of course, he had an unfair advantage. He had his own television show at the time to promote his book, and I did not.
I love that you, all these years later, you remember the book that beat you out. I sure would.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember words that I got struck out in spelling bees on to this day. So I don't let go very easily. But that's an amazing result. And what an extraordinary thing he did for you.
Yeah, he sure did. Walter was a very generous man. Tom Soule, in his obituary that he wrote on townhall.com today, mentioned that. And Walter was very charitable, apparently gave away a lot of money and supported a lot of causes that were close to him. And he was that way with people, too. And in fact, after this happened, I sent him a $100 bottle of wine because I knew Walter Williams was a wine connoisseur and a cheese connoisseur, for that matter. And he did me another favor a couple of years later like that, and I sent him another bottle of wine, and he was kind of offended by it. He thought, I'm doing my friend a favor. You don't need to send me any wine or anything like that for that. And so that's the kind of person he was.
Let's talk about one of his works. He wrote numerous books. I have a signed copy of his book, The State Against Blacks. Somebody just wrote to me through my website to say they had read what I wrote about Walter Williams in my email newsletter, and I mentioned that book, and they said that the cheapest they can get it on Amazon now is for $1,000.
Yeah.
And so it was, did I know how he could get one? I thought, well, you ain't getting my signed copy, that's for darn sure. But I did have him on to talk about his book, Race and Economics, how much can be blamed on discrimination. And you told me I just found this out, that you actually used that in a classroom setting.
Yeah, I did. I taught an undergraduate class called Law and Economics, and I used 4 or 5 different books and a lot of internet articles on it. And since race is such a big issue, it's pounded into the brains of college students from the left, from birth almost. I thought this would be a good book to use in my law and economics class because it is all about the effects of laws and regulations on and how various laws and regulations have economic effects that have racial consequences, not necessarily racist, but racial, and affect Black people differently than white people. And so I used that as a textbook, one of the textbooks in my undergraduate law and economics class. And the students loved it. These were economics students, and they had heard all the other arguments. And the basic line by the left is that because of the legacy and slavery and Jim Crow and so forth, that it's hopeless. Black people can never make it on their own. They need help by white leftists to survive in American society. And Walter's research, and a lot of other too, Sowell and others, flies in the face of that. And one thing this book does is to point out that of the tremendous success that Black people made after slavery on their own through entrepreneurship, and it has always been the state that has interfered with their progress through occupational licensing regulation, minimum wage laws, the DavisBacon Act, and all sorts of things that even if they're not motivated by racism, they have racial effects in that they create barriers to entry to occupations for primarily, disproportionately, for Black people have historically in the United States and elsewhere. And the students, these economic students like that because it adds a dose of elementary economic reasoning to understand these issues rather than just the never-ending moralizing that they get from their left-wing professors.
What seems to happen is that in the U.S. in recent decades, state policies that harm Blacks are not, they're not described that way. It's not obvious. There's not an act for the purpose of keeping Black people down. But there, as you say, there are things that have that effect. Whereas if some so-called civil rights leader comes along and says, look, I got 50 new Black jobs in my district, well, that's something everybody can see. But there are a lot of ways in which jobs that might have been created for Blacks go uncreated, or Blacks can't get them, but they're not earmarked in some way that would make it obvious that this is what has happened. So it's a case of what is seen and what is not seen. So, for example, what is the DavisBacon Act, and how does that have any effect on any of this?
That's a good example. Walter Williams writes about that in his book, Race and Economics. And the DavisBacon Act was enacted in one of these 1930s era laws. And there are state DavisBacon Acts also at the state level. And it says that any building that goes on that involves government money, and the federal DavisBacon Act means that there's a federal grant involved, even if the grant is only 1% of the total cost of some kind of a commercial development, let's say, or a road or something like that, then you have to pay what are called DavisBacon wages, which are also called prevailing wages, which is a euphemism for the union wage, the union scale, which is often higher than the wage that would, say, some upstart contractor would charge. And that the DavisBacon Act has also always had a discriminatory effect toward Blacks, because, back in the 1930s, when these types of laws were originated, there were a lot of black people who came from the South, which was pretty much devastated by the Roosevelt administration and its agricultural programs, paying farmers not to raise crops and raise cattle and things like that. And so the sharecroppers disappeared basically, and there was a flood of mostly black sharecroppers to the Midwest and the North in general, looking for manufacturing jobs. So what the DavisBacon did is that all these people who were coming looking for jobs, you might have had a black man who was a hard worker and is good shape, he's in physical condition, he's healthy, and he's willing to work a labor job for, say, $3 an hour, but the union scale job is $5 an hour. Well, the blacks started taking these jobs on the free market, and the unions wanted to stop this. And so one tool that they used was the DavisBacon Act, because somebody who does not have quite the experience as a union worker who was trained as an apprentice and who has 15 or 20 years of experience, well, in that day, he was worth $5 or $6 an hour to employers, more than that. But the black guy from Mississippi who shows up in Chicago, who has maybe 6 months experience, he can do the job, but he's not quite as good as the other guys with 15 years experience, but he can do it for $3 an hour. And so that effectively priced the black people out of a job. And that was effective. Tom, some years ago, the Maryland Chamber of Commerce invited me to testify at a hearing of the state assembly on this topic. And it was right after the Baltimore Ravens stadium had been built. And in the hearing room, were all these black businessmen who were contractors. They had small plumbing companies, small electric company with a few electricians, and they had all basically worked for some big company and then went off on their own and formed their own company. And they were shut out by the DavisBacon Act, the state DavisBacon Act. They had very little work building this gigantic stadium, which had, work galore for plumbers and electricians and bricklayers and all that. And the Maryland State Assembly, of course, was then, as it is now, totally in the pockets of the labor unions in the state, absolutely refused to listen to the logic of how the state DavisBacon Act had kept these black entrepreneurs out of the market. And so what they did instead, at the end of the hearing, they promised to impose quotas next time. They said, the next time we have a big building project like this that involves state money, we'll make sure 30% of the contracts go to black companies, whether they deserve it or not, and on merit. And so these black businessmen that were in the room with me, they were saying, we want to be judged by merit. We do good work and we charge a little less than the unionized companies, and that's how we want to compete. But the Maryland State Assembly did not want to hear it because they didn't want to antagonize their labor union patrons, which had kept these black men out of work for several years in the state of Maryland.
I'm pretty sure in Professor Williams's book, South Africa's War on Capitalism or War Against Capitalism, which was a book on apartheid. It's been a long time since I've looked at that, but there must have been treatment of labor unions there. And that's one of these issues that's difficult for progressives remember when progressives used to pretend to like the working class? To deal with the fact that their beloved unions may have had the effect, intended or otherwise, I think it was intended, to keep non-whites out.
It certainly was under apartheid. Walter Williams gives chapter and verse about that in his book, South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And things like the DavisBacon Act and the Minimum Wage Act, they were very clear about it. And Walter quoted chapter and verse of the labor unions in South Africa. And by the way, their slogan in the early 20th century, the labor unions of South Africa, the slogan to support apartheid, was sort of taken from the Communist Manifesto. It was workers of the world unite, keep South Africa white. That was the union slogan. And the way in which they kept South Africa white, so-called, at least the labor force, was such things as the DavisBacon Act, which they knew would be harmful to black workers who were trying to compete for labor jobs with white workers by offering to work for a lower wage. They have less experience. They couldn't command as high wage. And also the minimum wage law. They were very explicit about the minimum wage law, being a way to keep these workers out, because they understood that these guys were not quite as experienced as the white unionized workers. They did not have the benefit of, say, a 2-year apprenticeship program to become an electrician, although they might have had known a trade like that, but they weren't quite as productive, and so therefore they couldn't command quite the wage. And they fully understood that they could price these people out of a job with minimum wage laws and the DavisBacon Act, which is sort of a kind of a minimum wage law. And another anecdote story I could tell you, Tom, is years ago when I taught at George Mason, I had a student, Tom Rastisi, who's an old man now like me, and who's I think still teaches at George Mason himself now. But he was an undergraduate student in one of my classes, my class in public choice, and he wrote a term paper on the political economy of the minimum wage law, and he read through the congressional record of the 1930s of the debates over the federal minimum wage law here. And back then, he has all these quotes in his paper that he wrote from the congressional record, businessmen, not just businessmen, but members of Congress representing manufacturing areas of the country, coming right out and saying, well, we've got to do something about all these black workers coming out and underpricing our good, high-paid union men. And we think the minimum wage will do the trick. We'll do that. And I helped Tom rewrite this. And this is back in the 1980s, I think 1985. And it was published in the Cato Journal. So if you go on the Cato,
in fact, I've got it right now. I'm looking right at it. I'll post it on the show notes page.
Yeah, and he has chapter and verse. So it was identical to what happened in South Africa, as documented by Walter's book, South Africa's War Against Capitalism. The politicians weren't quite as sleazy and sneaky in the 1930s, apparently. They came right out and said these things.
Yeah. That's great. I knew about that, and I had seen a couple of those quotations, but until you mentioned it just now, I hadn't known there was a full-blown paper on it. So,
that was Tom Rastisi's paper from my undergraduate public choice course in 1985. I helped him rewrite it, and we sent it to Jim Dorn at the Cato Journal, and he published it in the Cato Journal. And to this day, it is still an excellent analysis of the politics of the adoption of the minimum wage and how it was intended. It wasn't just a law of unintended consequences that it has deprived millions of young black teenagers of jobs, the minimum wage law. That was always the intent in the minds of a lot of people. And another part of the intent of that was there's sort of a North-South division. The South, after the Civil War, it took the South an entire century to catch up to the North, to where it was in terms of the relationship between North and South economically. And so being relatively impoverished, a lot of Southern workers, not just blacks, but everybody, they weren't as skilled and experienced in the manufacturing jobs that were paying better. And so they too, white people and black people, were offering to work for a little less because they were less experienced. And Tom Rastisi also documents in that article sort of a North-South division that manufacturers from the northern states would say things like, well, we've got this steel being manufactured in Birmingham now, and it underprices our steel. It's cheaper than our steel up here in Pennsylvania. We've got to do something about this. We've got to increase the wages of those people down in Alabama making the steel so that their steel would become more expensive. And of course, that means that the products made of steel, like automobiles, also become more expensive. But it's all to benefit the labor unions, and not just the labor unions, but the corporations who are unionized. And being unionized, of course, gave them a competitive disadvantage compared to the Southern companies that were finally beginning to be competitive in the 1930s and 1940s, after the Civil War.
I want to make sure everybody knows what the show notes page is. So this is episode 1791. So at tomwoods.com/1791, that's where you can find this article that we've been talking about just now. And then, of course, the books that we've been talking about, including Tom's book, The Real Lincoln, which you should read. And I'll also link you to Tom's most recent book, which is it The Problem with Lincoln?
Problem with Lincoln, yes.
Yeah, okay, because we did an episode on that too. Hey, everybody, just a quick thanks to our sponsor, Policy Genius. This sure is a time of year when you find yourself lightening your wallet and running around like a crazy person. Well, if you need life insurance but you don't want to deal with the hassle or the expense, try Policy Genius. Policy Genius combines a cutting-edge insurance marketplace with help from licensed experts to save you time and money. You could save 50% or more by using Policy Genius to compare life insurance. Super simple. Just head to policygenius.com, and in minutes, you'll be working out how much coverage you need and comparing quotes from top insurers to find your best price. You know you need to be doing this, by the way. You know Old Woods is right about this. And it's so simple because then Policy Genius compares policies starting at as little as $1 a day. And you might even be eligible to skip the in-person medical exam. And then the Policy Genius team handles all the paperwork and red tape, and they've earned a 5-star rating, over 1,600 reviews on Trustpilot and Google. So if you have loved ones who depend on your income, don't go into 2021 without life insurance. Go to policygenius.com and get started. You could save 50% or more by comparing quotes and start the new year with one less thing to worry about. Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. So looking back at the Race and Economics book by Williams, I see some familiar themes that I would also see in Milton Friedman and in Williams's earlier work. For example, about how occupational licensing can hurt people and their ways of excluding blacks from certain trades or making their lives difficult there. And what's particularly insidious about that is that these things are made to sound fairly benign, right? They're just enacted for the sake of ensuring the public good and that everybody is getting access to quality goods and services. And I don't think people stop to think about the consequences of that. And there's no black leader who ever got in trouble for not working to repeal these things because people are simply unaware of the racial impact of them.
Yeah, the late Milton Friedman was a proponent of drug legalization, and he was a big critic of the war on drugs. And for many, many years, he wrote a lot about it, spoke a lot about it, and he distinguished between a racial effect and a racist effect of prohibition, to get off the topic just a little bit. And the racial effect was that the enforcement of the drug laws disproportionately harms young black men. I mean, it's obvious to everybody who pays any attention to it. And that doesn't mean the people who wrote these laws, connived and said, ha, 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 let's devise a law that will put all these young black guys in jail. No, it had a racial effect. And the occupational licensing laws, some of them have the same kind of effect, a racial effect, even if they weren't advocated by people who were racist and wanted to harm them, although some obviously were. Walter documented that the apartheid laws also used occupational licensing as a way to keep black people from competing for the jobs held by white union members. So that was a racist effect there. And there have been examples here. Walter, in his book, gives you another example of this, of Roosevelt's National Recovery Act, which put price supports on just about everything, including, and then the minimum wage law came later. But Walter documents how, it was called the NRA, National Recovery Administration. And Walter documents how, at the time, it was known in the black community as the, quote, Negro Removal Act, because unions were empowered by the Roosevelt administration, almost from the beginning, and the unions were very racist. And so they kept their new powers that were given to them by the government, enabled them to keep black workers out of getting good union jobs. Tom, my father was a unionized iron worker, and this was in the mid 20th century. He retired in the 1970s, but I can remember as a teenager that in Western Pennsylvania, where I grew up, in Eastern Ohio, it was virtually impossible for a black man to get one of these better paying skilled labor jobs like iron worker till the 1970s. And that was all the work of labor unions. Labor unions had such a hold on who got to have a job. And that has changed now. It's a very different world today. But for decades and decades, that was the world we lived in. And so Walter documents that in his book, Race and Economics, about how it was called. There were a lot of names for it. One of them was the Negro Removal Act, Roosevelt's NRA.
I want to share something that I'm fond of that shows his, whimsical side, let's say, but at the same time, you can tell there's a serious issue involved. He was as opposed to political correctness as anyone. And he wrote this. Well, first of all, did you ever see his proclamation of amnesty and pardon?
Oh, yes. I thought of concluding that in my obituary, but I didn't. but I decided it was a little too long. I might still put it up on LouRockwell.com.
Okay, all right. I'm going to read it out loud. Yeah,
okay.
I quoted from it in my own little tribute to him yesterday. So it's Walter's proclamation of amnesty and pardon granted to all persons of European descent, because he, as a black man, can give amnesty. So he says, whereas Europeans kept my forebears in bondage some 3 centuries, toiling without pay, whereas Europeans ignored the human rights pledges of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, whereas the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th and 14th Amendments meant little more than empty words. Therefore, Americans of European ancestry are guilty of great crimes against my ancestors and their progeny. But in the recognition Europeans themselves have been victims of various and sundry human rights violations, to wit, the Norman Conquest, the Irish potato famine, decline of the Habsburg dynasty, Napoleonic and Tsarist adventurism, and gratuitous insults and speculations about the intelligence of Europeans of Polish descent, I, Walter E. Williams, do declare full and general amnesty and pardon to all persons of European ancestry for both their own grievances and those of their forebears against my people. Therefore, from this day forward, Americans of European ancestry can stand straight and proud, knowing they are without guilt, and thus obliged not to act like damn fools in their relationships with Americans of African ancestry. Signed, Walter E. Williams, gracious and generous grantor.
That is vintage Walter Williams. Very, very eloquent too, wasn't it?
Absolutely incredible. Now, I don't know offhand how long he wrote that newspaper column, but it sure seems like forever.
He was right. When I got to George Mason University in 1981, Walter Williams was already a nationally syndicated columnist. So at least 40 years, Walter wrote that column. And in my obituary, I mentioned, Tom, that one of the things that got me interested in economics in the first place is when I was a freshman in college, the first economics course I took, Econ 101, the professor used a standard textbook and a book of readings by Milton Friedman called An Economist's Protest. And Friedman was a very nice, popular writer, a good thinker. He could explain things. There were, essays about the case against the military conscription and the case for privatizing the post office and things like that. And I thought, well, this is fun. Economics is really a fun thing to study if this is what it's about. And it was. And it was very much in the vein of Friedrich Bastiat, the great 18th century French economist. And Walter, I think of what Walter has done with his columns is 1,000 times more than what Milton Friedman ever did in terms of popular writing. And he and Tom Sowell, for decades and decades, all these wonderful columns, and many of them have been made up into whole books. And so I ended my obituary in saying that I would like to think that there are thousands of young people who, like me when I was young, stumbled across this, and that sort of ignited an interest in causing them to pursue this line of educating themselves. And I'm pretty sure I know that has had effect on Walter's readers. I've had lots of emails today in response to my obituary on LouRockwell.com from all kinds of people who never met Walter, were never within 1,000 miles of him or anything like that, but they've been reading him for decades, and they've been telling me their stories of so much that they learned. And there's no way to measure that, but he has had a tremendous impact on America in a positive way, along with Tom Sowell, his best friend.
Well, let me point out, maybe, I don't know if you know this or not, but our friend Bob Murphy, who's been extremely prolific as an economist, credits in part Walter Williams for getting him interested in economics. So in some ways, we owe Bob Murphy to Walter Williams.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
I hope that doesn't end up on Walter's gravestone, but that's a good thing.
So we've got all that. I'm going to put also I had him on my show twice, and then I went back into the archive. I used to fill in when Peter Schiff had a terrestrial radio show. I used to fill in for him, and I interviewed Walter Williams on that, and I made that later on into an episode of my show. So I got 3 appearances where the two of us had a conversation. So I'll link to those all on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1791. We'll also have the books we've been talking about, that article we mentioned, and Tom's The Real Lincoln book, and also his most recent, The Problem with Lincoln. You should read them all. You're not going to There's not one of these books where you're going to say, I really regret reading them, except maybe if you spend $1,000 for The State Against Blacks, you may have buyer's remorse just because of the price tag. But try and find that at your local library or get it through interlibrary loan or something. But Tom, I appreciate you doing this at the last minute, but I wanted to do this while it's still on everybody's minds, and because I felt that he deserves to have some kind of tribute on this program. So thanks for doing it.
My pleasure, and I agree completely. He certainly deserves a tribute, and thanks for doing it, Tom. Those of us who are good friends of Walter really appreciate that you have done this.
All right, folks, that's going to do it for today. Monday, I have, I think, a very special guest coming up in connection with the virus, a pretty well-known name. He's a tremendous person. You're going to love hearing from him. So look forward to that on Monday, and thanks for listening.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.